Good evening, everyone. Okay, well, it's great to see so many people joining us tonight. I'm Jocelyn Gardner, founder and chair of Print London. And on behalf of our collective, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first in a series of artist talks titled Exploring Intaglio, Making Conceptual Magic. Each of the three Ontario-based artists we've invited to speak in this series is incorporating intaglio, one of the oldest printmaking techniques, into their wider practices. Drawing on the mystique of this magical medium, they're manipulating it in fresh and inspiring ways as a means of expressing contemporary ideas and issues. Exploring intaglio follows on from the Mastering Lithography series of talks that was held in June 2021. While virtual artist talks were birthed in a very particular moment with which we're all very familiar, Print London found that we benefited from the ability to extend our reach far beyond London and have therefore decided to continue with this format. The Zoom presentation is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook and will be available for viewing on the Print London YouTube channel. Before we begin, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we'd like to acknowledge that the land on which Print London gathers is a traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples who have long-standing relationship to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. The local First Nation communities of this area include Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations of Turtle Island. This evening, Cindy Talbot will be helping to facilitate our Zoom event and Facebook live streaming. Cindy will advise on how to have the best viewing experience. Cindy?
Hi, everybody. As Jocelyn said, my name is Cindy Talbot. I'm the Vice Chair of Print London. I want to welcome you to our talk tonight and apologize for the technical glitch. Ironically enough, I'm advising on tech and the glitch was because of me. So hopefully that will be it for the rest of the night. So in the meantime, I've got a few technical housekeeping notes for those of you who are joining us on Zoom that will make your viewing experience hopefully a little bit better. So if you're joining on a laptop, you're going to select the speaker view in the Zoom window that's showing. So you click in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom window and then click speaker view. That way you'll only see the one person as opposed to all of the different blocks of names. To avoid distractions, we've muted you and turned off your mic and turned off your video. So we'd like you to stay in that position for the remainder of the presentation, please. We will be fielding questions during the presentation for Elizabeth to answer. If you'd like to ask a question, you need to type it into the chat box and our moderator, Jocelyn, will read the questions out to Elizabeth. If you're joining from a laptop, you should see a toolbar along the bottom of your screen. You're going to click the three dots more and then click chat. And we'll ask you to select the option where you send the chat to everyone. That way everybody will see all of the questions and we won't be duplicating questions to go to Elizabeth. If you're on your cellular device, you tap the screen to bring up the toolbar, then click on the chat icon and select the option to send to everyone. If you're viewing through Facebook Live, you can type your question into the discussion below the live stream and I'll pass them along to Jocelyn through the Zoom chat. And I think that takes care of everything. So Jocelyn, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Cindy. Sorry. Okay. So now I'd like to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Elizabeth D'Agostino. I first met Elizabeth around 2007 when I was working on a project at Open Studio Fine Art Printmaking Center in Toronto, where Elizabeth is an active member. Her work intrigued me then with its aesthetically sensual exploration of images from nature, repetitive patterns, and bold colors on delicate Japanese papers. Over the years, it has evolved to address the environmental discussions surrounding biodiversity, climate change, and urban growth. In her artist statement, she writes, quote, "The work aims to celebrate our capacity for a connection with nature, the conservation between living and non-living things, and a desire to mitigate ecological destruction. The work acts as a creative laboratory for studying dense ecosystems and overlapping habitats, calling attention to the delicate balance between human activity and the environment," end quote. Elizabeth holds a BFA from the University of Windsor and an MFA from Southern Illinois University in the USA. She works in print media, drawing, and sculpture, and her current practice is inspired by the records of observational and scientific illustrations, Canadian flora and fauna, and 19th century botanical illustration, specifically plant morphology and its visual identification. Her methodology is at once archival and imaginative, as she draws together these image sources to create new narratives and relationships that address the complexities of the changing landscape and how various paths of nature have been interrupted. She states that her, quote, "interests in native and non-native plants and animals as archetypes evolve into fictitious environments, constructing stories from merging elements, both imagined and real. These subjects are extracted from their current environments and assign new roles within a fabricated landscape," end quote. Elizabeth's work has been shown widely in Canada and internationally, and can be found in many public and private collections, both here and abroad. One unusual commission, which I remember, was her 2015 selection by the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Canada to create a custom carpet designed for Canada House in the UK. We're excited to welcome Elizabeth to present her work to us tonight, and I'll ask her now to turn on her camera and PowerPoint. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Let me just try. Aha. Can you all see my screen?
We can, thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this really nice, warm and balmy Thursday evening. And thank you for the introduction, Jocelyn. I would like to express my gratitude to Jocelyn and Cindy and the entire Print London board, the collective, and the community at large for inviting me. What I'm going to do is just talk a bit about just break down my work a little bit in terms of where my ideas come from, my methodology, and how I kind of work into the next level with both the conceptual and kind of technical approaches with the work. The work is pretty heavily layered, and so I'll just kind of give you a breakdown of that process, and just show you how things evolve when I'm working on the press. So the first few slides are images from my studio, where I have a growing collection of found images, objects, things from my neighborhood garden, my travels around the city, objects that are sometimes seasonal. So I've lived in the city for over 20 years, the city of Toronto in 20 years, and I've watched things certainly change as it relates to my little neighborhood, but just in general in terms of where I grew up. And so I'm constantly picking up found things from from my travels that really inspire me and just kind of give me some substance in terms of how I begin my drawings. So I like to reorganize a lot of these shapes and essentially take components from the various elements to produce collages and to recreate these shapes into patterns. So I love building stories within the work. And so every little piece or fragment that I collect, it somehow kind of evolves into this new narrative or new story that I like to create within each composition. And so from the collections of drawings and collages and documentation, I see this as essentially a type of field work where I start to build these stories. So patterns are often drafted from many of these objects, pulling various specs and parts to create backdrops and layers ranging in scale and size. And so you'll see a lot of these repeated patterns that have been composed either through collage or Photoshop, and make their way into kind of larger fields of screen print or various backgrounds. So as Jocelyn said, I'm really inspired by the observational and scientific illustrations, Canadian flora and fauna, and 19th century botanical illustrations. I love this idea of visual identification and also archiving, not only from kind of, creating my own archives, creating my own collection and giving them their own kind of space and giving them their own kind of, places within the drawings that I create. And so I'm often referencing a lot of these images, plants, animals, microorganisms from my surrounding landscape. I draw these new taxonomies, and organic and ephemeral materials are often kind of, they're brought throughout my practice, building from natural objects like insects and birds and animals, and even geometric forms. So here's a very early work titled Nocturnal. And my current work begins to explore these environmental discussions surrounding biodiversity and urban growth. And within each of the compositions, I tend to build these relationships where everything communicates with each other. The material, as I kind of go through the talk, you'll see a lot of print and sculpture, but also within the composition as shape relationships begin to kind of communicate with each other. So this is a very mixed print where I've built up monotype to build up the saturated blue, and then there's a screen print, and then there are several layers of etching and dry point. And this is all on Western cotton rag paper. And so each project intends to illustrate animal nature in this, and the complexities of that changing landscape, as well as emphasizing how various paths have been interrupted. And so it's really a creative laboratory as I kind of work through each series of prints, and I'm building these various kind of vignettes or diagrams. So here's a photo of two types of fruit trees that are grafted, and this is something that my father used to do with his fruit trees. And we spent a lot of time outside as kids. We grew everything. There was just really a lot of outdoor time that was built into the way we function and the way we live. So I used to observe my dad work on this process where you take two separate varieties of fruit trees and fuse them together, graft them together. He would merge them. And I just thought this was like the most amazing thing to try and figure out and understand. And, historically, there's a long history behind this, that, just cultivating a larger, more variable crop in a smaller urban setting. And so this is just, a random reference, but essentially we would get two types of kind of fruits on one tree. And it was just it's so magical and so interesting to see this process and to see what yields out of this, and particularly as a kid. So it's something that's an image that really stuck with me, just as a visual for many years, and it kind of makes its way into my practice quite a bit. I'm also really interested in the adaptation or the interaction with an organism and its environmental or physical change. So here is an image from my grandfather's property in Italy, and they are kiwis, and they are not native to Italy. However, they came in by an agronomist, I believe, and essentially it was really to provide alternate crops for rejuvenating the rural economy. And so, there's about 5 or 6 acres where my family still lives. And instead of grapes, there are now kiwis. And so what's so unique about this and this visual is that these kiwis, they're abundant and they're lush and they thrive in this volcanic mineral rich soil, but they grow very similarly to grapes. So there's nothing really that needs to be done in order to set up the structure, the infrastructure for it to grow and thrive. And so it kind of replaces this. And so it's just this really amazing image for me, because it's not only feels very out of place, but it's so heavily layered and it's so lush and it's really incredibly healthy. So this piece is called Minima Artificialia, and it also includes a number of layers of monotype where I've printed the green surface or the green, printed the paper green, layered it with many different layers of ink, and then applied silk screen. There's etching and dry point, and then there's a bit of photo etching. And so each component from the natural world is rendered through traditional drawing, print media, patterns, and technology intertwined with the influence of urban growth and cyclical changes. So this really kind of, all these mediums really find their way into the work very holistically throughout my practice. And the form and structures tend to carry a heightened sense of interconnectedness, demonstrating both animal and plant attributes, often appearing indistinguishable and creating their own dense topographies and essentially somewhat of an underlying dystopian thread that alludes to some kind of disruption to the habitat. So this is a cicada, and these are you see them out now in real as we tend to approach the real hot dog days of the summer. And so I've had this real love for cicadas my whole life, and I'm not necessarily fond of insects, but for me, there's something very magical about the cicada. And I do remember, growing up, my father pointing out those sounds to me, and when I was a child, and trying to figure out where that big sound comes from, and and him telling me that it's an insect, and trying to figure out, such a small thing, and this loud buzzing, chirping, snapping, whirling sound coming from this small insect. And the sound is really 80 to 100 decibels in volume, so it's quite loud, sorry. And so the sound is very nostalgic to me because it does signify the long hot days of the summer, and just really being mesmerized by that magical sound. And while they seem a bit daunting, they often get they often get compared to as locusts, which tend to have that negative connotation, but they are really beautiful, magical insects. They their wings are very translucent, and they're waterproof, and they're antimicrobial, and they leave this most amazing exoskeleton, and which remains intact and usually still attached to a tree, so that real rich amber color. And they spend most of their lives underground until they come up and emerge, right? And they emerge with such a force. So that cicada, really just the shape in itself is that hard shell, and then all the various parts, those fine lines, all those fine marks that really make this magical insect. And so these are actually European water chestnuts, and they are an invasive aquatic plant. And the leaves of this plant they're circular in pattern, and they're triangular with in shape with serrated images. And they just, the plant just, it just gathers in areas of fresh water and lakes and ponds, slow moving streams and rivers, negatively impacting, the aquatic kind of ecosystems. They just kind of float on top. They take over where there's, and so it doesn't allow a lot of oxygen to get below and feed what is below. And so you can see they have these sharp barbs on them extending off their hard shells. And so that shape and the serrated leaf patterns, they are used as kind of reference for fuel in terms of some of the work, but also, just the shells themselves are just this really unique, unusual object that is somewhat, can be somewhat familiar, but it's definitely, also unfamiliar, but carries a lot of weight in terms of what it can do for the environment. And so relationships between print media and sculpture are inspired by essentially this interspecies communication. And so with the drawings that I do on with the prints, I pair them up with a lot of these three-dimensional objects. And so, and what happens is there is this kind of collision of sorts between the images, and they're often characterized as these icons or archetypes, and they're evolving in these fictitious environments, just constructing stories between them. And so these kind of evolve from press molds of plasticine, and then they are cast in a rubber mold, and then a plaster mold, and then they're hand painted. And so these, this kind of shiny shell-like quality really kind of evolves from these shells of insects and these shells of these water chestnuts, and they carry, a lot of these similar patterns that eventually evolve into the prints that I use, or the prints that I create. So this is called the Journal of the Unlikely Botanist. And so there are these like botanical classifications for artifacts where there's vegetable and animal characteristics that are born out of nature, but modified by space and environment. So they have like little claws, they're these bulbous forms, they carry these kind of fine lines similar to, insect wings. And so at this time, I started transitioning from working on Western cotton rag paper to Japanese washi paper, specifically Gampi tissue. And I would usually working from anywhere from 6 to 9 grams, extremely, extremely thin. But there's a history and lineage of washi, its strength, and ultimately its sustainability. So the use of the paper really just begins to blend holistically within the work. So Gampi displays such a visceral quality that that easily transforms the printed mark into something very physical that I find. The paper is delicate in appearance, but it's strong in function. It's also transparent and translucent, and both at the same time. And so it's easily activated. It has a rich tone. It has, very onion-like crisp surface. There's a slight sheen to it, and it makes this slight sharp noise, sharp and subtle when it moves. And so it really transforms the printed mark into something more tactile. And the mark, the etched line really embeds itself, just emerges, it embeds itself quite, nicely and just compactly within every fiber. So this is Escape from the Land of the Wandering. It's a series, and there are approximately 6 of these prints that consist of 2 to 3 parts, 38 by 38 inches. And it's really about observing and marking losses. At the time, my neighbor was building this really giant McMansion house, and it was really highly contentious in the neighborhood. And and so there was, and it just made me, the whole process was this long drawn out process in terms of, that the planning of this house. But then when the construction started, it was like, it was fast and furious, and there was just so much loss. And so there was witnessing change that was rapid. And, I was really observing and studying and documenting. And, I just found it very disturbing. And so, I just really ended up documenting this. And what I ended up finding was, once the second story got up, second story went up on this house, is that I would tend to find dead birds on the ground that wouldn't make their way through the laneway anymore because they just couldn't. And so it was a different type of collecting now, right? And so there was a bit of a mourning loss there. And so on the flip side, I was also really trying to understand what I could do with the paper because it was new to me. And so I really had to dig deep into this work and figure out how to learn the paper, use the paper, how I wanted to use it. And I didn't really know what that meant at that time. And so, and I was really drawn to the way that it was transparent and translucent. So in this series of work, there's a combination of etching with dry point, and then there is 2 layers of screen print as well too. And so the more I used the paper, the more I learned how it worked and how exactly I wanted it to work. And so it was a bit of a labor of love on this part because it was really challenging because of it was so thin. But when it did print and it did transfer those marks, it was really what I wanted. I could see the quality of the mark transferred right through the paper, right through all elements or all levels of the fibers. And so this is just a close-up shot of the Gampi. And so I tend to use conservation Gampi, and it comes on a large roll. And it is used for conservation, whether it's books, mending, but it's just a really beautiful material to work on. And so this is titled Artifacts of the Self-Made, and it's essentially a visual recording or documentation of starting this imaginary archive from nature, just of these found objects. And so what I found when I was testing out a lot of this work is I ended up with a lot of off prints, and I really needed, and they weren't printed 100%, but they were printed in the way, they weren't printed in the way that I wanted it to kind of evolve, but I held on to them. And so part of this work was really trying to figure out not only to create this archive, but also, how I could blend in a lot of these offcuts. And so circles and spheres are really embedded in nature, and they can naturally occur or be man-made, but there's also a cycle of, plant life connected with the circle. But I also just love the fact that, there's a real intimacy of holding something in my hand, right? In the palm of my hand. So I started to take this material back to my studio, and I started creating these cylinders and half moons, and really being informed by the transparent and the transparency, and also being informed by the etched line and the aquatint that was on the paper and off the prints, and start building these forms and shapes. And so these are actually on cylinders, and these are actually on styrofoam, kind of styrofoam half balls. And the cylinders are on PVC pipes, where I've actually put the layered some of the photo etchings and some of the etchings on, so you could see the light through it. And so I take these back to my studio, and I cut, and I just start, I use scissors, I use an X-Acto knife, and I just collect all these piles and I start to really randomly build these pieces. And I essentially don't know what I'm going to end up with some of these objects. They evolve kind of organically throughout the process. There's I work on a number of them at the same time, and then I put them off to the side, and then I continue working on them as well too. So you'll see that there is, there's screen print here, there's some monotype, there's a lot of etched prints that make their way back into the work, into the three-dimensional objects. And so here's just an installation shot from the side. So the next series are a few of the etched plates, and I like to show the etched plates quite often because I'm really fond of the copper that I use for etching the prints, and so they become very much like objects, the copper plates. And there is, copper is I use 24 gauge, which is pretty thick, but it's very soft. The material is very soft and it's very malleable. And it's something that I just really quite enjoy working on because it is very soft. And as we all know, printmaking can be quite laborious, and so can etching. But for me, the drawing process, when I lay down the ground on the on the degreased plate, and then I start to draw, I can get lost for hours, really just drawing. And the process is it's the drawing process and the etching process are, the plates go through many steps. There's a lot of sanding, there's a lot of polishing. There's several attempts at aqua tint to really build up tonality. That's going to, create volume and hold, some dark areas. And then there's revisiting it over and over again. And so it's very, it's something that I work on like several plates at a time, and I'm constantly scraping, burnishing, drawing again. And it's a place where my head and mind are often quietly lost in this process for hours, composing each narrative and just really temporarily leaving a lot of my anxiousness, right? When I'm on, working on these plates and working through this process, there really is nothing else that kind of comes to my mind or interrupts this process other than, just the drawing and these stories that I'm trying to make within the compositions. And so I end up creating this repetitive tiny line work and marks, and I create these maps of movement on the plate. And then, I go back and, there's a lot of additive and subtracting methods, and there's scraping, burnishing, and wiping, and it's all very holistic. And so here's the wiped plate. So these are about 15 by 8. This is about 15 by 18 inches. And so this area, when I do the aqua tint in this circle here, it's usually 2 or 3 times of fine aqua tint and going back and sanding and then polishing and then going back and putting another aqua tint. So I'm just really, it's a lot of push and pull on the plates. And then here's a series that are all wiped up, inked and wiped. And so here is the print, Deer with Pod Sack. And so this is the start of series of work called the Makeshift series. And so according to Oxford Dictionary. Makeshift is temporary substitute or sufficient for the time being, improvised and thrown together with whatever is around. So this series holds essentially two meanings for me. Holding it together for the time being and hoping it will last, right? So there's this ephemeral kind of time-based element, or utilizing what you already have so nothing is wasted. So reusing without acquiring something and new to address the issue. And so this series really evolved in terms of dealing, working through the various building of layers and how to do that with the Gampi, but also playing with the material and what it can do in terms of this transparency and translucency. And so it's actually two sheets. The top sheet is the etching. So it's the circle with the deer and the little pod, and then the line work. There's the collage on the bottom left. And then at the top is hinged a second sheet behind it. And that second sheet is a screen printed Gampi sheet. And so it's hinged at the top. And so it's actually loose on both. It's loose on the left, the right, and the bottom, and just tacked together at the top. And so these are actually small additions. They're usually I do about a small edition of 5, and they're varied editions. And so I'm creating these invented scenarios where paths of nature have somewhat been interrupted, and there's something that's distinguishable within the compositions, but then there's something that's very unfamiliar and odd, and they're building their own topography within these invented kind of vignettes or stories or landscapes. And so the collaged shapes, they come from the drawing. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, each one has a collaged element to them. And that usually happens at the end after I've printed and hinged all of them. And then I take it back to my studio and I begin the collage. And those shapes are really drawn out of the kind of current shapes that occur within the actual composition. And so sometimes I follow the kind of the collaged etching matrix, and I'm cutting around it, or I'm kind of building a whole new shape that's very relative to a shape that's already within the composition, in the way that the mapped marks really kind of evolve on the surface. So there's a lot of random cutting and a lot of random placing. There's a lot of adding and subtracting, and there's just a lot of sifting through the printed paper, the washi paper. And I actually, I have a large flat file drawer where I keep a lot of scraps, but then I have lots of little Ziploc bags where I keep all the scraps, and I kind of just lay them out, and then I start pulling from all these sources. This is rabbit with artichoke sack. And so here are the copper plates again. So anywhere from 18 by 24 to 15 by 18. So once the prints are completed and dried, then, I can start that foundation of, the building blocks and collaging and, problem solving by identifying shapes and lines and marks. And that's when the next layer begins, and they kind of take on a whole other iteration, and a new story begins to take shape. Another one from the series, the Tomorrow Forest. And it's essentially the same thing. There's 2 sheets that are hinged at the top. So the screen print underneath and the etching on top with the collage. You'll see where the blue is on the left and right hand side. And so here I am in my studio, cutting and gluing I use rice paste, or I use a glue stick, an archival glue stick. I tend to travel to residencies a lot. And so what's really beautiful about working with Japanese paper is that I will put a roll in my suitcase and I will pack a small bag of, scraps, and then I'll pack, scissors, glue, and I will take that with me. And then, everything kind of comes back somewhat used, and just, prints are completed, and, I'll roll everything back and put it in my suitcase. And so once these are cut and I start cutting, I don't actually reprint these. I'm just, just taking what I already have and just building from a lot of these pieces. And so just another one of my prints based on kind of my travels through the city. And that bulb form tends to show up, quite a bit in the work, right? It's, I feel like I'm somewhat capturing this kind of shell of some sort, or, when I think about a bulb, I'm thinking about, planting bulbs as well too, but it's just this thing that carries a lot of volume, and it has weight and it takes up space, and yeah, so, and it just, it can hold, whether it's kind of a closed vessel, it can hold a lot, but it's just, it comes in the work, it just shows up in the work, and it just seems to be this kind of really effortless shape that everything begins to build off of. And there's the print. So I use a lot of printed color fields, and the printed color fields I do myself. And you'll see on the top here, that is a stack of, just very, pure paper there, untouched. And so it goes through a number of processes to really build up the color. And each color each color field is built up through a number of passes through the press. And I end up with stacks of paper where I just spend kind of a day where I'm just producing, right? And then I take that back to my studio, and then I start to kind of evaluate and figure out what I'm going to do with it. So this is at Open Studio. And so I use monoprinting techniques to build these colors. And so what I do is I will roll out a large swath of color. I use a lot of transparent base. I normally start with a dark color, and then I begin to, then I roll it out onto a substrate, which is plexiglass or a piece of acrylic. And then I place my paper on top, and then I run it through the press. And then I roll up again with another color of ink, or the same color of ink. And I do this about 3 or 4 times, sometimes more. And it's just transferring the color onto the Gampi. And so then I just take everything back. I let it sit there just to kind of dry out and air dry. And then I start composing from the prints. I start working with the printed etched Gampi sheets. And then I start pulling things together to create these vignettes. What happens with the etchings and on Gampi is that they curl, they furl a lot, they wrinkle. So I actually iron the paper. It's another thing I usually take with me when I go into residency is I take an iron and I iron the paper. And so that helps to flatten it. It doesn't go back to its initial kind of flat, shiny, real crisp, but it flattens to an extent that I'm able to, to continue using it. And so when I take everything back to my studio, I start rearranging everything. And this is where everything starts to kind of evolve, beyond the addition to print. And so you'll see the owl in the center. That print in the center or to the right is 15 by 18, approximately. It's I do the print as an edition, a small edition, usually like out of 5. It's usually a varied edition because in each one the collage is different. I take one of those prints and then I work with that print and I start to branch out with these larger sheets, creating this kind of small wall installation. And I also take from that as I'm moving off the wall now, and I feel it's almost kind of the next step as I'm trying to kind of, because there's just such a physical kind of quality to the way that I work in terms of the cutting and the adding and the subtracting, that I started to kind of just build these kind of bulbous, three-dimensional objects that just rest on top of these shelves. And they kind of sit at certain points where there's a slight overlap in color or just the edge, very similar to the way that I'm layering some of the images that kind of sit up against certain edges within the 2D prints, and they're slightly resting in certain heavy areas of marks, or they're somehow embedded. So it's all, there's, once again, there's that communication that kind of evolves between the elements. So this is the series of Makeshift, where I started building these kind of large vignettes. This is 40 by 48 inches, and it is a combination of etching with screen print, the collage on top, and then monotype and more screen print on the larger sheets of paper. And then that pod or that bulb that you see is it's paper clay. So it's essentially paper mache mixed with clay. You don't need to fire it. It air dries. It's very, very light, and they're hand painted. And so here is the owl with the pod sack. And so here the owl essentially emerges from a backdrop of those noisy cicadas. And there's really that nostalgic childhood memory of those long summer days, and just trying to remember those sounds and those visuals, and just that mysterious insect that looks essentially a cross between a beetle and a crayfish. And so it just emerges from this deep underground, and then it'll eventually soon shed its skin. But it's also the owl as well too, and such a magnificent, mysterious animal as well too, that is hardly ever seen. It's obviously it's nocturnal, but if you ever get to see one, it's pretty magical as well too. So these stories of these mysterious and magical animals that begin to kind of tell their own story of kind of surviving within their own little made up topography begins to evolve. And so this is another one from the series called Fox with Podsack, very similar. They're all relatively overall dimensions, 45 by 54 inches. And so here's a picture of the sculpture, and it's actually very, very light, and the base weighs more than the sculpture itself. But they're hand molded, they're paper clay, and they're a combination of press molds from kind of rubber molds, and then they consist of shapes like horns and bird-like kind of elements, wings and feathers, wires, and then they're hand painted in acrylic. And, they all have these kind of, they're in this kind of bulbous tuber pod-like kind of format. And within each of these objects, nestled in certain crevices, you can see that there are additions of some of the Gampi paper that's been adhered to or assembled within the object itself. And so there's a larger picture of the installation. Another image of these kind of bulbous like vegetation. And I mean, they're presented on these plinths as almost these objects of curiosity. Essentially, it's like almost look what I found, and then they're being put on display as well. So, there's that element as well too. Found within these kind of, they're within these environments and then plucked out and put on display. And so here's another series, other collisions, another another set of or suite of prints where there is this invented topography. The sheets they're printed and stacked and layered and shuffled again, collaged and cut and reassembled. So once I'm done the print, goes back into my studio table, and then I start sorting. Through all the prints. And so once again, I'll do a small edition out of a varied edition, like usually 5 or 6. Then I'll set one aside, and then they evolve into something a bit bigger in terms of the new topography or their own little environment or landscape. And I've started to kind of really move away from these heavily saturated colors of monotype and actually trying to use minimal ink and really stretching it out using transparent base. And so that there is more of a slight gradation, but there's also, less of the ink that is being used, essentially less is more. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how this series of work has started to evolve. It's like a lot lighter in terms of the prints, in terms of the fields of color, but all still very rich. Okay, so this is Makeshift Tales, and this is a large installation that combines print and sculpture again. Print using etching and silkscreen, but also monotype for the larger areas of fields of color, and then also digital printing on washi paper as well too. And then the sculpture component is, I took a class at the Gardner. I just really wanted to work with clay. And I really wanted to have something that just felt a little more permanent in terms of the sculptures. And so this is kind of based, so I started working with these cylinders, and I started working with the press molds as well too, and started really building these ceramic cylinders that started to have all these appendages, right? And the appendages kind of came out of some of the previous prints, but kind of following the same suit as these, these objects that have kind of morphed into these new shapes from their kind of landscape. Here's a detail. So they're fired and glazed, and then they've also have Gampi paper that's adhered to certain crevices as well. and they rest on these pseudo-geometric boards or plinths, and on the board or on the plinth there's various angles. They're all different, and I've adhered the prints, some of the printed prints, both digital prints, mono prints, screen prints on the surface. So what I didn't anticipate when I was doing the layering of the prints is that there's different weights, right? So the paper stretches, it shrinks, and when I'm cutting it, it's not always straight. So the digital print where you see the green, these are from photographs that I created. And so they were printed digitally on a large Epson digital printer. And then I started cutting away at certain areas and collaged them onto the surface. And so what happens, obviously, when you have two different weights is that there's the furling, there's the billowing of the paper. And so there's just something that I couldn't control. And it is what it is. And for me, there's nothing precious about that. And it's just that is the way that the paper is going to behave when you start working with the different weights and they start interacting with each other. And so so that's kind of, I guess, essentially a happy accident that happened. It certainly doesn't bother me. But it just really kind of speaks about what the paper will do. And so these are just detail shots of each one where this is, you'll see it's a bit of everything in terms of monotype, the digital print, and then the screen print on the Gampi, all it assembled within these shelves and these objects. And so, they've evolved into just really building this diagram or this compendium of various ecosystems, or just this fictional catalog of fictional categories. And there's also, there's this competition between the layering and between the growth. And so when I started layering these shelves, I started thinking about, mushrooms that grow in the woods in these kind of vertically, right, stacked in these bundles. And so, I started placing all these in this kind of organized, stacked or staccato kind of leveling of these shelves with these objects on them. And each one is different. So this is the next set of work. Let's see, it's titled Megafauna and Other Collisions. And so once again, on each shelf rests a paper clay hand-built form. And, it's somewhat familiar. It's an organism. It's somewhat unfamiliar, but it is, for me, it's more refined in the way where I'm blending the paper clay and the sculpture and the printed material, or the print. And they're collaged on the form, and they start to really blend in more seamlessly. And there is also a digital print that rests on the plinth, and it's a digital print of a photo, and that photo is essentially, where this object has been found. And so it's like, look what I found. It's on display. It's kind of taken from its habitat and put on display. And so these are very small. The top of the plinth is 8 by 8 inches. And so you can see where there's press molds again that have been used And then there are the paper has been adhered, or the print is adhered to the actual object itself as well too. Just coming to the end of the slides here. So this is a print that I did for a print portfolio for Puerto Rico, or for the Southern Graphics Conference that was to be held in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And it was titled Mapping the Anthropocene. And the portfolio, the portfolio was based on the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And and essentially it was, this catastrophic storm that, just really took a hit to Puerto Rico, not only in its community, but also with, the landscape as well too, and really kind of sounded an alarm in terms of, climate change. And so it left a lot of destruction and, a lot of how are we going to mitigate this? And so one of the, so it was really a call to action in terms of this print portfolio, and how each artist was to respond to this abstract, having this information. And so what I ended up doing was looking at, because I was not familiar, I'm certainly not familiar with San Juan, with Puerto Rico at all. And, I found that there is this large forest, El Yunque forest, that sits on the eastern part of the island. It's like, it encompasses over 28,000 acres, and it has over 240 species of trees. And what ended up happening was it decimated part of this, the rainforest and much of the flora and fauna. It created major deforestation, landslides, and displaced a lot of habitats, animal habitats. And so the coqui frog is a familiar symbol of Puerto Rico, and it sings, and it's you see it a lot in in Puerto Rico. You see it, and it's just an essential mainstay within the environment there. And so this piece, called The Different Type of Wild, is really essentially kind of this discussion on how the forest begins to recover. Suddenly there, what used to be completely shaded is now this new sun exposure, because there's no blocked sunlight. And so it just begins to examine the altered environmental system, and records what might transpire with various species that begin to overtake and change the ecological composition. Many of the plants they just generated or rebirthed. They were dormant for such a long time, and now there is this sun exposure. So it's like, what happens now as this rebirth begins to happen? So the print in the portfolio was 10. The parameters were 10 by 27 inches, and with a fold in the center. It was a unique format. And so here I began. I think it was an edition out of 20. And so here I began with the paper, where I took the 10 by 27 inch sheet of paper, and I built up the monotype, which is the green, on each sheet. And they all vary a little bit. And then I screen printed, there was a hand drawing of a hibiscus, and I screen printed that on the surface. And then the etched plate, where you see just, the black, you have the three kind of hills here, the contour, that is the etched plate that has been cut. And then I cut the paper, and then I adhered it to the print, and then there's collage. And so each areas where the collage is adhered to is different. So it's a varied print, but the bulk of it, or the main print, is essentially the same. And so, of course, we all know what happened after that. That was 2020, and the conference got canceled, and the world shut down, and it's COVID, right? So Where I print at Open Studio was, like everything else, was under lockdown. And so I had some prints that I had started in the process, and they weren't done. So I started working on this new series where this titled Paradigm of Wonder, these bird tales, where I have these two birds that are essentially resting on each other. And there's this kind of, need in this for each other, but there's also this duality. And to be honest, I didn't know what I was doing at this time, because I felt really kind of lost without a press. And so I started to kind of work on this series, creating a varied edition with 2 layers of prints. Once again, the etching on top, the screen print behind with the ferns. There's ferns behind it. And then the collage on top. And then, taking that back to my studio, once again, doing my stacking and my organizing and my layering. And then, I started to assemble everything. I started making some more 3-dimensional paper clay objects. And because I couldn't go in and print, and I had a ton of these offcuts, off prints, I started actually using my sewing machine as a tool. And I just started sewing. These lines and these strings and poking wires through some of these kind of tubes. And then adhering them to some of the kind of paper clay objects that I painted. And just really there were just a lot of unknowns, and I'm kind of at that point right now. Like, I feel like I'm really at this juncture where I'm not sure where I'm, what my next body of work is, in terms of, starting with a new series. But it did lead me to complete a number of large drawings. From this Paradigm of Wonder series. So this is really, really large. There's a series of 3 of these. This is just acrylic and charcoal on paper, and they're 30 by 44 inches. They're just, it's just, to be honest, I'm really not sure, but they become these building blocks for the next kind of series of work that I'm working on in terms of etchings. And so, this is kind of where I'm at in terms of, the latest stage of collecting and layering and using all these tiny little kind of strings that I've sewn, and wires through these tubes to kind of begin to kind of create these shape and spaces with print and Japanese paper. And that is my last slide.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was great. Great amount of detail in your process, which is really interesting for us who love to see process. It's I think as we've all collectively turned back to nature and to slow observation and those things, it's been really eye-opening to see how much of that is embedded in your work. I hadn't realized. And so it's been very fascinating to hear you talk about it and to learn more about what is embedded there. I think we probably have questions, so I'm going to just open up the chat and have a look. So I'm not sure if you can see it, Elizabeth, but the one that I'm seeing here, sorry, let me see if I can scroll up. Okay, I think Elizabeth Forrest was answering a question.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
It's okay. The Gampy, yes. Gampy is the type of paper, yes.
Yeah. Okay, and Charlene has said thank you. Emma O'Brien, it's so fascinating to hear about your very creative process, and thanks for sharing your insights with us.
You're welcome.
And Lori says, so much of your work resonates with me. Thank you. And Charlene says, Elizabeth, so great to see you again. Okay, so does anyone have any questions for Elizabeth?
Oh, there's a question.
Okay, can you read it then, Elizabeth, or would you like me to read it?
I'll start with the first one. So what is it that draws you to the transparency? You know what, I feel like it's just really luxurious. Like it's just really, I don't know, like it's challenging. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to it. There's just a really beautiful sensibility to it. And I think it just parallels nicely with nature as well too. And it's just really difficult to not be so attracted to it. And I think that's why. Yeah, I don't know. I hope that answers your question. Kathleen, my goodness, I haven't seen you in ages. Can you talk more about your use of color? Yeah, so I mean, it's really trying to, I mean, it's kind of two ways. Like one is trying to extract that just real local color that I see from direct observation, right? So there's the direct observation from the drawing itself, and then there's the direct observation of really attracting that pure saturated color that we can see so much in nature. But you know, it's like this fleeting image sometimes, right? But it's something that is really kind of, I find now, certainly as I get older, it's very striking, right? And it's very palatable, but it's very like, it's very attractive. There's also the use of some of the colors that are much more like, you know, like the chartreuse, or I've got some oranges where they're almost a bit too false, right? They're just they're a bit too, you know, they seem too man-made. And so there's that as well too, right? So there's that duality that comes into it, right? Like it's very kind of, it's a bit jarring, right? It's a bit too fabricated. And so, you know, it's kind of that, you know, that thing where, you know, it's drawn from nature, but, you know, it may not necessarily be great, right, for the environment or for that space or for that animal or for whatever, for that habitat, right? So there's something false about it that's man-made that, you know, that you know, evolves into the work as well too. So it's kind of like that beautiful thing. Like it's really beautiful, and you can, you know, and it's just, you know, really bright, but then it can also be somewhat kind of repulsive a bit, like, you know, and so yeah, like, and it's saturated, and so I feel and I guess it becomes quite saturated also because of the paper itself, right? The paper really lends itself in that way. Okay. Something about Southern Graphics. Will the addition of Southern Graphics be presented at another conference? I don't know. It goes in the archives, right? They have that main archives that they do somewhere in the Midwest. It did. I got a beautiful box for it, and you know, there were about 20 other artists in that, and I feel like it did get maybe it wasn't at the conference that it was exhibited. I think it was exhibited at the two curators, or the two hosts, or the two folks, the two artists that organized the portfolio at their respective universities. Did I have any reservations about digital printing? Yes. The cost, I'm not gonna lie, it's expensive. And would I like it in the end in terms of the way that I could use it? And I couldn't use it in its full entirety, right? I had to use portions of it. That's just helped me. Yeah, that just, I couldn't use the larger prints in its full entity. It just didn't feel comfortable for me in terms of what I wanted. Although, you know, the photographs were mine, and, you know, I did all the work, and they were on the Japanese paper. They were on large sheets of Gampi, or washi that could be digitally printed. but then I ended up taking portions of it where I had to kind of cut parts of it to use it. So I had to really be very strategic about it. So it, I just didn't want to waste it. So yeah, it was kind of it was learning to like the paper itself, just learning how to use it within my practice. And do I feel the ceramics help to go for? Yeah, totally. I got a box of porcelain here that I want to use, and I don't know what to do with it. So, yeah, I did, because I felt like, I tried throwing, and I thought, well, maybe I'll just throw. I couldn't throw a form to save my life, and so hand building was the best thing for me, and it just made a lot of sense. And then I loved the glazing part. I loved the way that I would glaze it's very similar to the way that I started laying color as well too.
Elizabeth, there was a question you missed above that's asking you whether you will always work in series. It says, I love your work and I'm curious about the titles. Do they come to mind before or after the work is done?
Do you think I do work in series. It's very difficult for me just to work in kind of one thing at a time. They for whatever reason they end up in multiple things, right? Like, and I guess it's that, I feel like sometimes it's like that cog, right? And the gears keep going, and then when it stops and it clicks, it just feels right, and then I need to stop, right? Sometimes that's kind of the way that it works. In terms of the series, I feel very comfortable. Like, it just feels, in terms of the language, it just feels very comfortable for me. And then the titles, it's in process when I'm doing the work. I hear things, or I make up things, or it's part of the story, and so I just write them down. And so yeah, sometimes they come in, they evolve during the process, particularly when I'm just in those quiet moments where I'm just drawing and kind of dreaming a bit. And then after I will kind of come to those titles afterwards, and then just kind of solidify them. When do you feel this helped you? When you sell your is it a problem with the pieces that you look like that are installed? When you sell your installation, is it a problem with the pieces that look like they're installed a special way? I don't sell those installation pieces. I mean, I've tried selling some of the objects themselves individually, but as for the installation, they just tour around for exhibitions, which is why I saved some of the prints. Which I end up taking, one of the prints, and I use those prints for, selling.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. You've had lots of comments here. I'd like to ask you to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and we will finish up. That was a wonderful talk, and it's borne out by all of the comments that we're getting in the chat. But we need to finish up. So thank you so much again, Elizabeth. Really,
you're welcome.
Appreciate it. I just want to promote that we have 2 more talks coming up in the Exploring Intaglio series. We'll have Emma Nishimura on June 15th, and then Tim Lauren on June 29th. So I hope everyone can join us for those talks. They will be in the same format, and of course we're also live streaming on Facebook, but it's lovely to have everyone join us on Zoom. So thank you very much for coming tonight. We appreciate the support, and yeah, it's been great. I'll give Elizabeth a virtual clap.
Oh, thanks, Jocelyn.
Okay, so good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Bye now.